I'm now going to move on to modelling the fins for our whiting. I'm going to start by simply adding a plane, rotating that 90 degrees around the y-axis just so it's facing the camera, and moving it up just kind of into a general position. It doesn't matter too much at the moment. And now by selecting both objects and hitting Ctrl and J, we join those two objects into one mesh. And going into the front view, we're going to move it over slightly on the x-axis, so it's just fractionally off centre. So we have a small gap in the middle. Back into the side view, I'm going to scale it down to a bit more of a usable size, as this plane is going to make a single polygon to start polymodelling out the fins. Just aligning the bottom left vertex with the vertices in the body, and again in the others, and merging these two just so we've got no excess, and just extrude these over just to meet up with the next vertex down on the body. And continue this down the length of that individual fin, and just align it with the edge of the background image that we placed earlier. Selecting these three here, I'm going to extrude these up just to continue the height of the fin, and just deselect this one and continue to extrude this one up too. And as you can see, this process just goes on extruding up, moving them around and scaling wherever needed. I'm then going to select these three vertices and make a try to connect these, and again here. And just aligning them slightly just to get the shape of the fin, and there we go, that's the first fin done. And the process for the rest of the fins is very much the same, so I'm just going to speed up the footage from now and just show you how I continue to go on and create the rest of the fins until I get to a suitable point where I need to explain more. Okay. Now moving on to the tail fin, one key point to note is that I reuse the existing vertex from one fin to start off the next. And the reason I do this is to make things easier down the line for the animator, or more specifically the rigger, because that one point can be weighted then for both fins, which will prevent them moving as separate entities that will both move with the same bone. And looking at the rear tip of this body, I can see this is going to need a little clean-up work before I can go any further. So I'm just going to select these three and merge them into the centre just by using Alt-M. And these two will just scale them in just to round that out slightly. And I'm just going to try and create some clean topology just around here, just to give a nice rounded edge. I'll just do that by merging these two and then just moving up the length of the body and continuing that. I can just use Shift-R to repeat the last operation, which is to merge to centre. As you can see, I just repeat that down the body. So that's looking a little better. As you can see, we've got some unnecessary tries at the tip there. So I'm just going to make them into, I can make them into quads. Just using F to create a new face there. And again, I've got a slightly strange topology here, so I can clean it up a little bit by merging them there. And as you can see, that nicely rounds out that topology. It goes around the shape of the rear of the body. Okay, looking much nicer. Just move this one vertex down back inside the body, and that's that sorted. So I can go back onto doing the fin. Keeping in mind how this will deform once it's animated, I'm going to extrude this vertex down, still along the same edge used for the body, just down to the middle, as I think that's where I will create the topology for the rear fin, and again just matching what I've got at the top. And then from here it just goes on to pretty much the same process as we used for the existing fins so far. So again, I'll speed up this section and you will get a general gist of how I go about it. I'm just going to go in and hide the main body now so I can see what I'm working with a little better. So I just selected all that and hit H to hide. And I think I'll just clean up this section just by adding a cut along here. And another one equal just beneath. And what this will give us is the square polygons that we're aiming for. The more square the polygons, the more even the distribution. And that really aids in not only UV mapping but also in the deformations later down the line for the animator, which ultimately end up in a better asset. So with them nice and square now, I'm just going to clean up this top corner because it's looking a little bit rough. So I'm just going to round it out slightly. Just move down this vertex here, move it away from the corner so I can add another quad in there. I'll extrude that up and scale it in. And if I just move this vertex here, I can make room for a new try, just to round that out. Okay, I'll tidy up. That's not looking too bad. Let's just take a look at that. Certainly much better than what we had before. Okay, just move these around a little bit, round them out. Get those quads back in shape. Okay, that's not looking too bad. Just take a quick look around, just make sure nothing looks out of line. Everything looks fine, so I think I'll move on to the next fin now. Okay, I'm going to move on to the anal fin now, and just as before I'm going to use that existing vertex from the tail fin, so that's connected, and just as before we're just going to go ahead and extrude out this topology using the edge loops from the body to aid in deformation later on. And very little is different from the fins that we did at the top, so again I'm going to speed this section up. Okay, so I wasn't at all happy with how the gill was looking, so I went ahead and looked at a little more reference, and it turns out that many of these species actually have a rounded gill, not like how I had it originally. So I'm actually going to round that out and see how that looks. I'm going to keep this section sped up just because most of it is just me making silly mistakes in the modelling, so there's no point in explaining that. As you can see, I've just chopped away the original and basically just remade it from scratch. Takes up a little tidy work just to get it to fit nicely how we had it originally, and it's now looking much better. I'm now going to insert a plane around about here and start modelling out the pectoral fins. I'll start by rotating that 90 degrees about the screen direction, which is actually the x-axis. And if we move into the front view, we should be able to see that a little better. I'll move it over to about the position we want. I'm actually going to join that to the body, as I want it to be part of the same mesh. And scale that down. As you can see, the mirror modifier is applying to this too, because it's the same model. And to be able to get the correct position in and the shape, I'm going to reuse the same background image that I had earlier. I'm going to add it as a new image because I want it to display from a different angle without affecting the original. So just adding that to the viewport just as before, and I think we're going to have to scale that down to get the size about right and move it over. Now this is just a little bit of guesswork really, moving that over to around about the same position as what we had before. Just about there should do it. Right, we'll put that up to full opacity so we can see it well, and go on to the modelling section. So just moving it down slightly, this is going to be our very first polygon to start modelling our fin. Changing it to vertices selection mode. I'll scale those up just to start getting that shape. And at this stage we're just doing really simple poly modelling, nothing extra, we'll add that later. I'm just using an extrude tool to extrude this out. Now with the basic shape in place, we can start filling this out a little using the Ctrl R, which is the loop cutting tool. I'm just using the mouse wheel to scroll up to add further cuts. So with that fleshed out a little, we can start rounding out these edges, just using the scale tool just as before. We can start defining that shape just a little better. So as you can see, just as before, I'm literally just scaling out the outer edges just to round it out a little and comparing that again to the background image. Okay, so what I need to do now is select all of those vertices, and I need to actually duplicate it since this section isn't mirrored on the y-axis, not by our mirror modifier anyway. So that's duplicate it, not extrude it, and move that over slightly on the y-axis, just ever so slightly, and flipping those normals as well. Okay, so just like the other fins, we have normals facing both directions. Just having a quick look around to make sure that looks alright. Okay, I'm just going to define that shape just a little better. Going into the wireframe mode so that I can select the back faces too. I'm just going to move them over slightly just to define that shape. Okay, so actually having completed that and just taking a quick look at it, I'm slightly concerned this is going to be too high poly compared to the rest of the asset and going to push me over my poly limit. So I'm going to reduce this further, practically redo the whole thing, just keeping the outline that we created. So I'll just speed this section up and you'll see how I go about that. Okay, so with the pec fin redone, I'm just going to check the normal direction of these faces because they actually need to be pointing the opposite direction. So as you can see here, by the blue lines, both of these are facing the same way. So pressing W and flip normals, we can see they're actually facing opposite directions now. And with this option still enabled, I can go on to check the normal direction of all the rest of the faces too. So these are all looking great, which is a good start, so I'll just save that there. Okay, so nearly finished now. I'm going to go on to doing the pelvic fins. Now, to do the pelvic fins, I'm actually going to cheat slightly, or recycle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of the pec fin, I'm going to duplicate that, and rotate that on the Z-axis, and that will align it along the length of the fish, which I need for the pelvic fin. So obviously moving that into place just using a grab tool and rotating it to just about where we need it. Okay, so now moving that into place along the x-axis, and obviously we've just got to do a little reshaping. So the reason I've recycled it is actually because of the mesh density is just about what I want. Not so much for the shape, we can adjust that quite easily. So rather than polymodelling it out entirely, it's just a case of selecting an edge loop, scaling it, rotating it, getting it to look something like we want, and then we can do individual vertice movements where we need them, such as here. Okay, so already you can see that's looking pretty much like what we need, and just with a few further tweaks we'll be pretty close to what we need for the final shape. So almost done with the overall shape of the pelvic fin. We're just shifting around a few extra vertices just to define that shape a little better, and that's looking pretty much how I want it. Okay, so we've now got to duplicate this just as before. So we have a back face on that, but before we do that, let's rotate it into position. So I don't want it hanging exactly vertical, and obviously we've got to move that up slightly so that it kind of blends into the body. We don't want to see any ugly edges. Okay, just moving that up slightly. And just spacing out the vertices. Just smoothing out these edges here. Okay, I can already see a potential problem with this. By rotating it and then moving the vertices up, I've actually destroyed the perfectly flat plane that we had. So I've just scaled that on the x-axis, made it perfectly flat again, and then moving the vertices up into place. What that then allows us to do is, as before, I can rotate these, put them into position I want, and then selecting all of them again. Now when I rotate them, they're perfectly flat, and what this allows me to do is to duplicate it without the two faces overlapping one another. So moving the whole fin up slightly just so it sits inside the body slightly. I can then just have a quick look around, make sure it looks okay, and as I said before, duplicate that just as we have done with all of the fins, and move that over ever so slightly on the x-axis. Okay, so with them moved over ever so slightly, just as before, I can see with the face normal still displaying, I need to flip these faces just as before, so pressing W and flip normals, and now the normals are facing opposite directions. Okay, so just about done now I think. Having a quick look around, I'm going to turn off this grid flow so I can see a little better, just move my cursor. Okay, so with the modelling complete, now I've got to fulfill some of the requirements of theBlu for the modelling, and that's to get the naming conventions in place. So I'm calling this whiting_body, all lowercase with no spaces, and I actually need to give the fins a separate name, so I'm going to have to separate them out by selecting all of them, just using L to select all, so that's highlighted. Okay, with them all selected, separate that, and I'm actually going to call these whiting_fins_alpha. Now the alpha is required to indicate that I'm using an alpha map on these, and that just allows it to go through the submission process much easier. Okay, so with the naming now correct, I now need to set the scale correct too. So I'm going to do this using the transformation panel, and to make things easier, going over to the scene properties, and just this one here, I can set the measurements to metric, and you can see that change on the dimensions section of the transformation panel. And using the dimensions I've got from the theBlu site, I can start to scale this down until the Y dimension matches the length of the fish. A lot of this is down to personal preference. I usually do it kind of somewhere in the middle of the range that is given. Okay, with that now set, you can see that the scale is now completely out. So I need to apply the scale. So selecting both parts of the mesh again, I can press Ctrl A and apply the location, the rotation. Oh, you can see by applying the rotation, that's actually messed up the mirror modifier, because that's been applied after the rotation. So applying the mirror modifier and then applying the rotation and then applying the scale. Okay, and the same for the fins. We can see now the scale in the transformation panel is now all 1, 1 and 1, which is exactly what we need. Okay, with one final check just to make sure nothing's out of place, I haven't missed anything. Make sure the geometry looks okay to me. That's all looking fine, so I think I'm going to call this an end to this, the second part of my tutorial series on modelling and texturing a fish for theBlu. Thank you very much.